The pen light flickers. Once, twice, then stops. Marcus Thorne just blinked murder with his paralyzed eyes. I'm holding the chart with the doctored records, my fingers shaking. The doctor who signed the lethal dose is St. Jude's golden boy, and he's coming down the hall. The oxygen tank swings at my skull. I shove the crash cart between us, snatch the folded paper from his pocket. His signature is on it. The hospital's star surgeon just tried to kill me. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator pulsed through the sterile gloom of Bay 4. Sarah Jenkins adjusted the plastic slide on Marcus Thorne's IV drip, her gloved fingers trembling against the cold tubing. The air smelled of sharp ozone and scorched coffee. Marcus lay anchored to the bleached sheets, his body a silent monument of atrophied muscle. Only his eyelids moved. Click, 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 click. Sarah froze. She leaned over the bed, the starch in her scrubs crinkling. Marcus's pupils, blown wide and dark, locked onto hers. He blinked with a deliberate, jagged cadence. Long, short, long, long. "Marcus?" she whispered, her voice cracking. She grabbed a clipboard, scribbling dots and dashes against the margin of a vitals chart. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She translated the flickers of motion, her pen tearing through the thin paper. U-R-D-E-R. Sarah's breath hitched. She looked around the room, the shadows cast by the monitors dancing like specters on the linoleum. Marcus wasn't just awake. He was screaming in the only language he had left. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to her, a frantic, desperate signal. He wasn't a vegetable. He was a witness. Who, Marcus? Who did this? He blinked again, the wet clicks of his eyelids sounding like a death knell in the quiet room. T-I-L-L-H-E-R. It's... A cold shiver raced down Sarah's spine. The killer wasn't a memory. They were a presence, perhaps just a few feet away behind the heavy oak doors of the ICU. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the leather cover of her apology log. Entry 4113, for not believing you sooner. She needed proof. If she went to the administration now, they would dismiss her as another overworked nurse suffering from burnout. She had to find the paper trail that Marcus couldn't speak of. The hallway outside Bay 4 was a tunnel of flickering fluorescent light and the distant metallic rattle of a janitor's cart. Sarah moved with the practiced silence of a ghost, her rubber-soled shoes gripping the polished floor. She reached the heavy steel door of the medical archives, the scent of old paper and stale air wafting out as she swiped her badge. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the cooling system. Sarah began to pull the physical files, her fingers dancing over the tabs. Thorne, Marcus. She spread the charts across a laminate table, the harsh light overhead making the ink bleed. As she cross-referenced the digital logs on a nearby terminal with the handwritten notes, the discrepancy hit her like a physical blow. The digital record showed a standard recovery path, but the physical notes, the ones the doctors thought were shredded, told a different story. A massive dose of anesthetic, 5 times the recommended amount for a man of Marcus's weight. It wasn't a mistake. It was a surgical strike designed to paralyze the lungs and the tongue. Someone had tried to turn Marcus into a statue, a permanent resident of the quiet wing where secrets went to die. The air in the archives grew heavy, the smell of dust suddenly cloying. Sarah's hands shook as she realized the scale of the deception. Every check and balance had been bypassed. The system hadn't just failed Marcus, it had been weaponized against him. She leaned against the cold metal of the filing cabinets, the sharp edge digging into her shoulder. She needed to get back to the ICU, but the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift. Sarah tucked the unedited chart into the waistband of her scrubs, the paper crinkling against her skin. She needed to find Bill Miller, the only person in this building who didn't look at her like she was a liability. As she turned to leave, a floorboard groaned. Not the house-settling groan of an old building, but the deliberate, heavy weight of a boot. She ducked into the equipment storage room, the sharp, stinging scent of industrial-grade latex filling her nostrils. It was a narrow space, crowded with stacks of sterile gauze and rows of blue oxygen tanks. She held her breath, her heart a drum in the darkness. A shadow fell across the doorway. The figure was a silhouette of jagged edges, masked in surgical scrubs that looked like a shroud. Without a word, the assailant lunged. Sarah dove to the left, the heavy clank of an oxygen tank hitting the metal shelving where her head had been a second before. Sparks danced in the dark. The attacker swung again, the tank whistling through the air with the weight of a sledgehammer. "Stop!" Sarah gasped, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of her own blood in her ears. She saw the heavy crash cart, its chrome rails gleaming in the sliver of light from the hall. With a surge of adrenaline, she threw her entire weight against it. The cart groaned, its wheels shrieking against the floor as it collided with the attacker's midsection. The figure buckled, the oxygen tank clattering to the ground with a sound like a gunshot. Sarah didn't wait to see if they would get up. She lunged forward, her fingers catching on a piece of folded paper protruding from the attacker's scrub pocket. She ripped it away and bolted into the hallway, her lungs burning. She didn't stop until she reached the service stairwell, the cold concrete steps vibrating under her feet. She collapsed against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a medication authorization form, the kind that required a high-level override. The ink was fresh, the signature bold and unmistakable. Dr. Robert Sterling, the hospital's golden boy, the man whose face was plastered on the Physician of the Year banners in the lobby. He hadn't just authorized the dose, he had choreographed the entire execution. Sarah felt the world tilt. She wasn't just fighting a lone killer. She was fighting the institution itself. She made her way back to the ICU, her mind a whirlwind of fear and calculation. She had to keep Marcus safe, but the doors to the ward were already swinging open. Dr. Robert Sterling stood at the foot of Marcus's bed, his silver hair gleaming under the harsh lights. He looked up as Sarah entered, his smile a thin, predatory line that didn't reach his eyes. "Nurse Jenkins," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "You look disheveled. The night shift is a heavy burden, isn't it?" Sarah gripped the railing of the bed, her knuckles white. "I'm fine, doctor. Just a busy night." Sterling didn't look at her. He looked at Marcus, his lips moving in a silent, rhythmic twitch. He was counting the ceiling tiles, his gaze drifting upward in that strange, mechanical ritual. "We've had a change in the budget, Sarah," Sterling said, finally meeting her eyes. "Maintenance costs for long-term patients are unsustainable. Marcus is being transferred to the Oak Haven Hospice facility. The transport arrives in 2 hours." "You can't do that," Sarah blurted out. "He's showing signs of consciousness. He's communicating." Sterling's eyes darkened, the warmth vanishing instantly. "He is a biological liability, Sarah, and you are an emotional one. 2 hours. Make sure his belongings are packed." He turned on his heel and walked out, the click of his expensive shoes echoing like a countdown. Sarah felt the walls closing in. Oak Haven was a dumping ground, a place where patients were managed until they stopped breathing. If Marcus left this building, he was a dead man. She fled to the staff locker room, needing a moment to breathe, to think. But when she reached her locker, her heart stopped. The metal door had been pried open, the hinges twisted like a broken limb. Her bag was overturned, her wallet emptied, and her car keys were gone. Sterling wasn't just moving the patient. He was trapping the witness. She stood in the middle of the room, the scent of lavender soap and stale sweat mocking her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her apology log. Entry 4114, for being too slow to see the trap. The lights in the hallway suddenly flickered and died. Sarah stepped out into the corridor, the darkness thick and absolute. She pulled a small penlight from her pocket, the beam cutting a weak, yellow path through the gloom. She heard a faint, rhythmic sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Someone was unscrewing the light bulbs, one by one, moving ahead of her in the dark. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a hunting ground. She needed the digital backup. If she could get to the server room, she could download the original logs before Sterling's maintenance team wiped them clean. She moved toward the east wing, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every shadow was a threat, every hiss of the ventilation system a whispered warning. She reached the server room door, the heavy air vibrating with the hum of 1,000 processing units. The temperature dropped instantly, the bone-chilling cold biting through her scrubs. She fumbled with the terminal, her fingers numb. Access denied. Looking for something, Sarah? She spun around. Michael Davis, the security guard with the uniform 2 sizes too small, stood in the doorway. He was tapping a heavy metal flashlight against his palm, his eyes darting to the exits. I just needed to check a record, Michael, she said, her voice trembling. Dr. Sterling said you might be confused, Michael said, stepping into the room. Said you might try to interfere with hospital property. He lunged, the flashlight swinging toward her temple. Sarah ducked, the metal whistling past her ear. She scrambled toward the back of the room, weaving between the humming server racks. She knew this floor better than he did. She knew the shortcut through the pressurized steam corridor. She burst through the heavy steel door, the high-pitched whistle of a leaky valve piercing her ears. Michael was right behind her, his heavy boots thudding on the metal grating. "Nowhere to go, Sarah," he shouted. She saw the manual release valve, a heavy red wheel bolted to the wall. She grabbed it with both hands and wrenched it open. A wall of scalding white vapor erupted from the pipes, filling the narrow corridor in seconds. Michael screamed as the steam blinded him, his flashlight clattering to the floor. Sarah dove through the exit door at the far end, the heat searing the back of her neck. She didn't look back. She ran toward the executive wing. Her only hope now was Dr. Elizabeth Vance, the chief of medicine. Vance was a pillar of the community, a woman who spoke of legacy and honor. Surely she wouldn't allow this. Subverted. Sarah reached the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite, her chest heaving, her scrubs damp with sweat and steam. This was the right move. Dr. Vance had mentored her, had once told her that a nurse's intuition was the hospital's greatest asset. Vance had the power to freeze the transfer, to call for an external audit, to strip Sterling of his credentials. Sarah felt a surge of desperate hope. She had the physical chart, she had the Morse code logs, and she had the evidence of Sterling's sabotage. The truth was too loud to be ignored. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling with a sudden, cooling relief. She could see the headline in her mind. Whistleblower saves patient, exposes corruption. The nightmare was ending. She would be safe. Marcus would be safe. She took a deep breath, the scent of expensive floor wax and old books calming her frayed nerves. She was doing the smart thing, the professional thing. She pushed the door open just a crack, ready to burst in and spill the truth. Through the narrow opening, she saw Dr. Vance sitting behind her obsidian-topped desk. The room was bathed in the warm glow of a desk lamp. Dr. Sterling was there too, leaning against the bookcase. Vance wasn't screaming. She wasn't calling the police. She was smiling, that cold, practiced smile that Sarah had seen 1,000 times in staff meetings. She picked up a crystal decanter and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. "To a clean slate, Robert," Vance said, her voice as smooth as silk. "The board will be pleased with the efficiency of the East Wing transition." Sterling took the glass, his fingers brushing hers. "It was a necessary pruning, Mother. The garden will be much healthier now." Sarah froze, the handle of the door feeling like a jagged piece of ice in her hand. Mother. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach, knocking the air from her lungs. This wasn't a failure of oversight. It was a dynasty of death. The Vance and Sterling legacy wasn't built on healing. It was built on the calculated liquidation of the unprofitable. The toast wasn't for a successful surgery. It was a celebration of Marcus Thorne's impending murder. And Sarah had just delivered herself to the architects of the slaughter. She backed away from the door, her knees buckling. The very person she had run to for protection was the one who had sharpened the knife. The hospital wasn't a sanctuary. It was a family business, and she was the only thing left on the ledger that needed to be erased. She turned and fled back into the darkness of the hallway, the sound of their laughter echoing behind her like the tolling of a funeral bell. The storm hit the hospital with a fury that rattled the windows in their frames. Thunder crashed, a deep, bone-shaking roar that drowned out the mechanical hum of the ICU. Then, the world went black. The primary power grid failed, the sudden silence more terrifying than the noise. A second later, the emergency lights flickered on, bathing the ward in a rhythmic, bloody red glow. Sarah reached Marcus's bed, her breath coming in jagged hitches. She was alone. Bill Miller had been escorted from the building hours ago, his grocery list probably still tucked in his pocket as he sat in the parking lot, wondering what had gone wrong. She looked at Marcus. His eyes were wide, the red light reflecting in his pupils like twin fires. "I'm here, Marcus," she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. "I'm not leaving." She saw an old analog EEG monitor in the corner, a relic from a previous decade that didn't rely on the central server. It was a clunky gray box with a roll of paper and a fluttering needle. She fumbled with the electrodes, her fingers slick with sweat. She attached them to Marcus's temples, her heart hammering in time with the rhythmic red flash of the alarm. "Marcus, listen to me. I need you to think. Think about your name. Think about the basement. Think about the pipes." The needle on the EEG monitor began to dance. A slow, steady rhythm at first, then a jagged spike of electricity as Marcus's brain responded to her voice. The paper scrolled out, a physical map of a mind that was very much alive. "I see you, Marcus," Sarah cried, a single tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. "I have the proof." Subverted. Sarah grabbed the scrolling paper, her heart soaring. This was the smoking gun. In the eyes of the law, this wasn't just a nurse's observation. It was a clinical, biological fact. No judge could ignore a spike this clear, this deliberate. She felt a surge of tactical brilliance. She would use the hospital's internal courier system, the pneumatic tubes that still ran on a separate vacuum line, to send this strip to the night shift supervisor in the pharmacy, a man she knew was honest. It was a perfect, old-school solution to a high-tech problem. She could feel the victory in her chest, a warm, glowing coal. Sterling could delete files, but he couldn't delete this physical strip of paper once it was in the hands of a witness. She began to fold the paper meticulously, her movements precise and confident. She was outsmarting them. She was the one in control now. She turned toward the pneumatic station, a small smile touching her lips. The red emergency light seemed less like a warning and more like a spotlight for her triumph. A valiant effort, Sarah. Truly. The voice came from the shadows by the door. Dr. Sterling stepped into the light, but he wasn't alone. He held a radio in his hand, the plastic casing gleaming in the red pulse. "Attention all staff." Sterling's voice boomed over the emergency channel, his tone dripping with a fake, practiced concern. "This is Dr. Sterling. We have a code silver in the ICU. Nurse Sarah Jenkins has suffered a violent psychotic break. She is delusional and currently endangering the life of patient Marcus Thorne. Detain her on site. Use of force is authorized for the patient's safety." Sarah froze, the EEG strip fluttering in her hand. What are you doing?" she whispered. "I'm managing the narrative, Sarah," Sterling said, stepping closer. "In an hour, the police will arrive to find a tragic scene. A burnt-out nurse who snapped, killed her patient in a fit of mercy, and then, sadly, took her own life. The EEG? Just a piece of paper in the hands of a madwoman." The radio crackled as security teams responded, their voices a cacophony of "copy that" and "on our way." Sarah realized with a sickening clarity that her proof was now her motive. In Sterling's version of the story, her attempt to prove Marcus was alive was just further evidence of her obsession, her break from reality. The smarter she acted, the more insane she appeared to the people listening to the radio. She wasn't a hero. She was a fugitive in her own ward, and the very evidence she held was the weight that would sink her. Sterling walked over to the desk and, with a casual flick of his wrist, swept her Morse code cheat sheet onto the floor. He ground his heel into it, the paper tearing under the weight of his expensive loafer. "You're alone, Sarah. Bill is gone. Your logs are deleted. And Marcus, well, Marcus is about to have a very quiet night." He produced a syringe from his pocket, the clear liquid inside shimmering like a diamond. Potassium chloride, a heart stopper. "The system is a machine, Sarah," Sterling whispered, leaning over her until she could smell the peppermint on his breath. "And machines don't have room for grit like you." He reached for the electronic lock on the wall, swiping his master key card. The heavy ICU doors hissed shut, the magnetic bolts clicking into place with a sound like a guillotine. Sarah was trapped. The red light pulsed, on, off, like a dying heart. Sterling moved toward the bed, the needle held aloft. Sarah backed away, her heel catching on the metal leg of a supply cart. "Please," she sobbed, her hand reaching out blindly. Her fingers brushed the cold, heavy handles of the defibrillator. She didn't think. She didn't apologize. She grabbed the paddles, the coiled cords stretching like umbilical cords of lightning. She dialed the charge to maximum, the machine emitting a high-pitched, rising whine that cut through the silence. "Sarah, don't be foolish," Sterling said, his voice tightening. He lunged for her, his hand catching her shoulder. Sarah slammed the paddles against the metal frame of the bed. Thump. The discharge was a blinding flash of blue-white light. Sterling's body convulsed as the current tore through the metal and into his frame. He was thrown backward, his limbs flailing like a marionette with cut strings. He hit the obsidian-topped desk and slumped to the floor, his eyes rolling back in his head. Sarah stood gasping, the smell of ozone and scorched fabric filling the room. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She grabbed her phone from the desk, the screen cracked but still glowing. She had pressed record the moment Sterling had entered the room. She stumbled to the wall-mounted paging station, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. The backup battery was still holding. "Attention," she whispered into the cool metal of the microphone. "Listen to the truth." She pressed play. Sterling's voice, cold and arrogant, filled every hallway, every ward, and every waiting room in St. Jude's. "Managing the narrative, Sarah. In an hour, the police will arrive to find a tragic scene. A burnt-out nurse who snapped." The confession echoed through the building, a ghost voice that couldn't be silenced. Sarah slumped against the bed rail, her hand finding Marcus's. His finger was twitching, a frantic, rhythmic tapping against her palm. ... Dash, 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 ... Asterisk. SOAS. The police arrived 20 minutes later, their flashlights cutting through the gloom like searchlights in a shipwreck. They found Dr. Robert Sterling paralyzed on the floor, his silver hair singed, and Dr. Elizabeth Vance being intercepted at the parking garage with a suitcase full of legacy documents. The Physician of the Year was carried out in zip ties. Sarah sat in the quiet of Bay 4, the red emergency lights finally fading as the primary power hummed back to life. The silence was no longer heavy. It was clean. She pulled her apology log from her pocket and a pen from her ear. Entry 4115. For not being afraid anymore. Months later, the sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the New Hope Rehabilitation Center. The air smelled of fresh lilies and floor wax, a natural, clean scent that didn't sting. Sarah sat by Marcus's bed, her hand resting on his. He wasn't the gray monument of atrophied muscle anymore. There was color in his cheeks, a spark of defiance in his eyes that no drug could dull. He looked at her, his lips curving into the ghost of a smile. Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing effort, he lifted his index finger. He tapped against her palm. T-H-A-N-K-I-O-U. Sarah closed her eyes, the warmth of the sun on her face. She didn't need to write it down. She didn't need to apologize for existing. The signal had been received. And for the first time in her life, the debt was paid in full.